Story Nori Extra, Young Bond with Charlie Higson. Hello, this is Natasha, and I'm really excited because I'm just about to meet Charlie Higson, the author of the best-selling Young Bond books. The third book in this series is just out, and its title has been chosen by a special internet poll of Young Bond fans. It's called Double or Die. In case you didn't know, Young Bond is all about James Bond when he was still a boy. It's based in the 1930s, and young James is still at school. In fact, he's a pupil at the top-notch British boarding school called Eton. Of course, his thirst for danger gets him into all sorts of exciting adventures and scrapes, which his headmaster would not like to hear about. My friend Hugh has been talking to some of the fans. He asked them which hero do they like most, Bond young or old?
I prefer young Bond. I think he's really funny, young Bond, and he gets up to loads of cool adventures.
Do you think young Bond is as cool as old Bond?
Yeah, he's cooler because...
Yeah, better.
What is it you think that's not so cool about old Bond these days?
It's always the same thing, actually. He just goes in, blows everything up, and manages his mission, and always gets a girl. So it's always the same thing.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, is James Bond just for boys?
No way.
Why do girls like him?
I'm kind of a tomboy, so I don't really count. You can tell he's Bond by reading it without knowing it's a Bond book, basically.
And what do you think about all his school days? Are they interesting?
Well, obviously they're a lot more interesting than normal school, and he gets up to a bit more than most people do. But yeah, I think it's good to know where his origins lie.
In a moment, we'll hear from the young Bond author Charlie Higson himself. But first, let me read you a little extract. James was gripped by a mixture of panic, fear and excitement. He had never driven this fast before. He could feel the body of the car shaking and rattling. Every tiny bump in the road felt like he was hitting a great boulder. His face was frozen, his lips forced back from his aching teeth. He fought to keep the car under control as it bounced over the road, but his hands were numb on the slippery wheel. He didn't know if he could outrun the Daimler. It was larger and heavier than the Bamford and Martin, but it was more powerful and its driver more experienced. Plus, the skull-faced man had the advantage of being able to follow James's rear lights. James had nothing. He was on the point of looking round to see how far behind the Daimler was when he felt a mighty jolt and heard a bang. They had rammed him. He swerved across the road and narrowly avoided a car going the other way, shrouded in a cocoon of spray. He fought the Bamford and Martin back under control and coaxed a little more speed out of her. She was still handling all right, so the collision hadn't caused any serious damage. But if they rammed him again, he might not be so lucky. There were lights up ahead, and they thundered into the village. James was aware of a brief blur of buildings and a howling racket, and then darkness again. This was fenland, flat and featureless for miles around. There was nowhere to hide out here. It was totally exposed. The wind cut across it, flat and hard. James wasn't sure how long he could keep this up. He was driving on instinct. The thinking part of his brain was shut down. His eyes were stinging, and no matter how often he blinked them, he could barely see anything. Then he remembered that his goggles were in the glove box. He leant over and fumbled for them, steering with one hand. His fingers closed round the strap and he yanked them out. He tried to pull them over his face. For a moment he was completely blinded, but then they were on. Almost immediately they were plastered with sleet and he had to wipe them clean, but it was still an improvement. Once again the Daimler rammed him and his head jerked painfully back. If they kept up this crazy chase, they would eventually either run out of road or crash. Either way, James was done for. Wow, I can't wait to find out what happens next. And sitting here with me is the man who penned those words, Charlie Higson. Charlie, welcome to Story Nori.
Well, hello there. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Can I start off by asking you, how are your books different in approach from the originals for grown-ups?
Well, all the things that James Bond is known for. are not things that are suitable to have in children's books. He's known for driving fast cars, drinking vodka, smoking cigarettes, shooting people, and kissing lots of women, shall we say. You can't really have a 13-year-old boy doing that in a children's book. But I try and get all those elements into the books. But I know, for instance, the area of Bond and girls is a tricky one for boys reading these books. In fact, I did an event once, and I said to the boys there, I said, how do I keep this character still as James Bond and yet not make it too yucky for you? What do I do about the scenes with the girls? And one boy stuck his hand up and he said, well, how about Bond goes to kiss a girl and at the last moment there's a huge explosion and they get distracted. So I thought that was a useful tip. So look out for lots of passages in future books where young Bond goes to kiss a girl and gets distracted by a big explosion.
There are some quite violent murders in the book and some rather scary bits among the tombs of Highgate Cemetery. How do you do violence for children?
Well, when I write these books, I read them out to my own boys. I've got three boys who are 8, 12 and 14. So I read each chapter out to them. And I can only say, if anyone complains about the violence in the books, it's not my fault. You can blame my children. They're crying out for more violence. Whenever if I'm reading a chapter and I'll introduce a new character and they'll say, kill him. I said, what, he's only just been in it for 2 lines. I don't care, kill him. Push him off a cliff or something. I want to see him die now. And I said, well, the books can't just be a string of people being killed one after the other. They said, yes, they can. My boys, that's what they'd like in a book, would be non-stop fighting. As far as they're concerned, that's what a story is, it's fighting. It is tricky doing violence in books. For instance, there's quite a lot in the new book about what happens, for instance, if you get shot by a bullet. And it's not like in the films where you just go bang and someone falls down and you carry on, like in the sort of classic James Bond shootout sequence. Actually being shot by a bullet is a very painful experience and it does terrible damage to your body. So I've tried to put in some actual sort of scientific and medical detail in the book, for instance, about what happens if you get shot by a gun. So I tried to put in the violence and the action, but temper it with a bit of kind of reality so the kids can step back and not just gloat in the bloodshed.
Was it one of your aims to get young boys to read?
Yes, that was one of the reasons I wanted to write these books. And there has been a problem and a lot of debate of people saying, why do boys stop reading? Why don't boys read as much as girls? And I do think that one of the reasons has been that there haven't been the books there for boys to read. When I was first given the job of writing young Bond books, I thought, right, I better go out and see who my competition is. Who else is writing these type of action-adventure stories? And there really wasn't anyone. Obviously there were the Alex Rider books, and that was about it. But I've had fantastic feedback from kids, from parents, from teachers saying my boy had stopped reading, or I couldn't find any books for the boys in my class to read, and thank you for the young Bond books. They're really getting into them. The books are set in the early 1930s. That was a sort of heyday of action-adventure stories for boys. There were a lot of books like that written in those days. And a lot of those books were the sort of books that had inspired Ian Fleming himself to write the adult James Bond books. So I think there is definitely a trend back to this type of writing. And, I think we are starting to see more boys reading books now.
You create a really believable world of this young Bond at Eton. Do you have experience of this world or known people who've been there?
No, it's very nice actually, because some people, including some old Etonians, have said, you must have been at Eton to get all that right. So that pleases me a lot. But no, I am like most writers, I just make things up. I had to do a lot of research for these books. I've been up to Eton a few times because Ian Fleming himself went to Eton, so they're quite proud at Eton of the kind of their connections with James Bond. It makes their school a little bit more cool.
Would you send your children to Eton?
My children go to the local comprehensive school in North London. I wouldn't send my children to Eton. Eton is a fantastic school, and the boys there get an amazing education, and they get an amazing education for life. They're taught a lot of things other than just the lessons. They're taught how to be with grown-ups, how to be confident, and it does turn out a very special breed of boy. But at the same time, I think the kids there are living in a bit of a bubble. They're not experiencing what it's like for a lot of people in this country. And I did go to a public school, which was an all-male public school. I wasn't a boarder, but I did feel For instance, it would have been nice to go to a school where there were some girls, but also to mix with a wider range of people.
Yeah, I really love the setting in the 1930s, which of course means that James Bond must be about 85 now. Were you tempted to make him a bit younger and a bit more modern?
When I started writing these books, there was a danger that kids would look at them and think, I don't want to read about this, it looks a bit old-fashioned. For me, Bond is modern and cool, it's about gadgets and modern flashy cars and all that kind of stuff. And that when the first book came out, when Silverfin came out, the publishers, Puffin, went out of their way to make it look as modern and jazzy as they could. The covers had a lot of sort of modern special effects on them with holograms and glittery stuff to make them look as contemporary as possible. And the publishers were very scared that if the kids got a sniff of the fact that these books were historical in a way, that they wouldn't be interested. And there was a worry that kids would think of James Bond as being the James Bond of the films and read these books and say, well, this isn't the same character. Luckily, that didn't happen. I haven't had any kids ever complain of that.
Well, being set in the 1930s, you bring in a lot of historical research, and they go to various different parts of London. Where did you go to do this research?
I live in London. I love writing about London. Before I wrote the Young Bond books, I wrote 4 adult thrillers, which were largely set in London. And I know London very well. I read a lot of books about London. So I already had a lot of background information. I knew that there were certain bits of London that I wanted to write about. And the climax of the new book, Double or Die, takes place in the London Docklands. And I did enjoy reading a lot about how Docklands used to be. It was the biggest, at the time, it was the biggest docks in the world. It was full of hundreds and thousands of ships. There's a very interesting museum in Docklands, off Docklands, and obviously the London Museum has got a lot of interesting stuff in it. It is useful to actually go out and do some research, and it's something I'm always telling my kids, actually. You can't just rely on the internet. It's amazing the amount of information there is on there, but you can't beat actually going to the places yourself and seeing it all for yourself.
As you said, part of the book is set in the Docklands, east of London, and this is when the economic depression was in full swing and people were terribly poor there. James Bond is rich and privileged. Did you have to be sensitive about the way you wrote that?
Well, Bond is privileged. He goes to Eton, but he's not from as rich and as privileged background as a lot of the other boys at Eton. He's very much an outsider there. But he realises that, you know, he's living in a very pampered world. And Bond does go to the East End of London, there's a very poorest part of London, and get a glimpse of how some other people are living. And it's interesting and useful to get that stuff in, because a lot of what was going on then in Britain and the rest of Europe was leading up to the Second World War, which was coming out of a lot of this kind of poverty and social unrest and people wanting change, and that's how Hitler managed to get a foothold in Germany. So because James Bond's life is so bound up with what happens in the Second World War and with the rise of communism in Russia, which is obviously coming from even more extreme poverty, is what created that. It's useful and necessary to get that stuff in, because that's what creates the secret agent that we read about in the later books and we see in the films. It's someone who's been influenced by all those different pressures.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. Just as a final question, I'm sure you've been asked it many times, who is your favourite James Bond actor?
Well, I grew up in the 1960s, and the first film I can ever remember going to see in the cinema was Thunderball with Sean Connery. So for me, Sean Connery will always be the best James Bond and will be my James Bond who I think of when I think of the film James Bond. Although I thought Daniel Craig in Casino Royale was really good, and I know he'd definitely be my second choice of Bond, and I know that there's a lot of kids going to see Casino Royale now who, for them, Daniel Craig will always be James Bond.
Charlie Higson, author of the fabulous Young Bond series, thank you so much for talking to Story Nori.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. We are going to be doing a few more occasional interviews with children's writers and artists. But of course, we're going to keep on doing loads of stories too. So don't forget to drop by at storynori.com. For now, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.